We're going to do some fairly major redistribution of light in this image, and for that I'm going to combine selections and gradients and local color adjustments. In order to follow this tutorial, I suggest that you familiarize yourself with the color adjustment tutorial and the gradient. If you work on an older version of Photoshop, CS3 or backwards, you need to check out the color legacy tutorial on how to adapt this color workflow to the older version. As you can see on the original image, the sky is very pale and the model is very dark. Also the grass is looking very dark. We need to bring out the bride, the model, and make the framework around her work for her to bring her out rather than the background. I'm starting here with a flat image. Normally I wouldn't, but this image has been color corrected globally, i.e. all over. What I want to start with here is the sky, making the sky a little bit richer, not losing the whites in the clouds, and certainly not making the model any darker. So I'm starting with a test patch and dragging a marquee over a patch of the sky. This is going to let me see how this affects both the clouds and the darker sky and compare this to the areas surrounding it. So I'm making a curve and using the target tool, click up here in the clouds just to anchor the highlight in the clouds, and then I can just drag the curve downwards here, making sure it doesn't go too dark. It can always be adjusted later on. Then I go to Edit and Fill with black at 100% and OK. Before I reveal this adjustment, it's now completely hidden, obscured by the black mask. I'm going to go on the background and make a selection for the girl. I'm going to use a magnetic lasso tool, I think, and just make a quick selection around her. You can use the pen tool or anything you like. It depends on the kind of image you're working on. On this one, I thought perhaps the magnetic lasso tool could be good to do. So I'm going to start in a corner here and work my way around the model. I've zoomed in and I've taken also a size of the cursor that I can feel comfortable with. I'm not being too accurate, but then again you do need to get it more or less spot on. If you do have any problems and you find that this tool goes a little bit off-piste, all you can do is just use the delete or the backspace key and just tap a couple of times to go back. So you see here I'm having a bit of a problem and I'm just using that backspace there to get back on track. Where you've got a good contrast, it's quite easy. And I'm using the space bar to navigate so that I can very easily, without switching tools, just get from one end of the image to another. So although I'm zoomed in, it's quite easy to work this way. In the hands, you may have to just hold the cursor down. Now, I'm not putting down many points, but when I get to the flower bouquet, I'm putting down a few anchor points, i.e. clicking with my stylus just to hold it. There are some intricate bits here that can be slightly tricky because there's a lack of contrast here, so I'm cheating a little bit on that. So when I get to the end, it will join up automatically and we get the marching ants. There are a couple of little holes that I need to make in this selection, so I change to the lasso tool and press down the Alt or Option key and just paint out these areas and these areas. Also, there's an area behind her here that could go a little darker, but we have to revisit that later. That should probably be softened up a bit. Let's also now select and save selection so we can use it later. I'm going to call it Bride. What I'm going to do now is inverse this selection. So I can either press Shift Command I or go to the Select menu and inverse selection. That means that the areas that are selected are everything but the girl. I'm going to do just a very light feather on it as well. So select, modify and feather that at just 1 pixel. Okay. I need to now highlight my mask again, going back on the curves layer, and that selects the mask. You can see there's a frame around it. I'm going to now take the gradient, G for gradient, and I'm choosing the linear gradient and making sure it's at the second gradient here, the foreground to transparent. Now the foreground happens now to be black, so I have to switch my swatches to get white because I'm going to use a white colour to reveal the adjustment in the mask. The adjustment, of course, being that darkening curve. So I'm going to pull that from the top of the image, and I'm working on a full screen background, and I'm using the Shift key also to keep my gradient straight here. And you see here that if we look in the mask, we can deselect here for a moment and Alt click in the mask. You see here you have a selection that goes beautifully down, darkening the sky but not the model. Alt click to get out of that, and I'm going to turn it off and back on again. So that's making the sky a little bit more juicy. If you now want to adjust even further, you can do so. So I think I can make it just even a little bit darker there. And turning that off and on again. The only thing I notice here is that the area to the right of the model is a little bit dark. So I'm going to take a brush tool there and press X to get black foreground and just use about 30, 40 something opacity and flow, and just carefully paint over these areas. In fact, I can go quite roughly here because it doesn't affect the white so much, and if the sky was dark just behind the trees I'd have to be very careful, but because it's lighter and hasn't been much affected by the adjustment, I can go quite sloppily on this. Let's just for a moment examine the transitions here, making sure that there haven't been any bad transitions. Turning the layer off and back on again. Having made sure there are no halos around the edges of the girl, I'm now ready to lighten her. Now if you were to take a logical approach to this, you might think that I would load the selection that I saved earlier and just use that for a straight adjustment, but I'm not going to quite do it that way. I'm going to take a mark key and do a test patch as I've done before with the sky, and I'm going to use another curves for that and target tool, and I'm going to zoom in a little further into her face and looking at where there is highlight. Now I'm going to target this area, just hitching it up really by the lightest highlight I can find in her skin, and then I'm going to take that curve down a little bit just manually here, but not below the baseline, just a touch down there to retain some contrast and make sure it doesn't go milky. Now let's have a look at that. The advantage of doing it this way is I can actually see now how that affects the sky around her should it spill ever so slightly. So I'm going to now fill the mask as usual, edit fill, and with black. Then I'm going to go into my channels here. Now looking at the channels, I have this saved selection sitting here. I'm going to command click on that, which brings the selection up. I'm going to just feather this selection a little bit. So select, modify and feather, and just feather it 1 pixel as before. I might even tighten this selection, so select, modify and contract the selection by 1 pixel as well. Just making absolutely sure that we're not spilling anything on the background of this. To hide those marching ants, which are going to be quite distracting, press Command H. So you don't see them, but you've still got the selection going. I'm going to take a brush tool now, and to reveal I have to press X to switch my swatches here. And this looks fine. The opacity and flow here is fine. And I'm going to start in her face. Now what the selection does, it gives us a protection against spillage into the background. We don't have to use it at 100%. I'm concentrating really on the middle regions, letting it fall off a little bit to the side there. I'm going to go quite easy, just 1 stroke on the veil, and work with a very big soft brush towards the bottom of the dress. The worst thing you can do here is get too hung up on being accurate or working with a tiny little brush. That's actually bound to make it uneven. So when you're airbrushing into this mask, just go easy on it. Use big brushes and trust the brush to let it fall off along the edges. Now I might go just a little bit into that dark fold here and into the fold there as well. And I'm looking at the colour of it, and I'm finding that although I didn't want it milky, I still think she's way too dark in the cheeks here. So I'm going to see where that is on the graph, just pressing that target tool and putting the eyedropper there in her face, and you can see that actually that corresponds on the graph of the curve to a very dark area. So I'm going to go back to the curve and just manually just lift that up a little bit and find a point here slightly further down, just to bend that back down again. 1 point maybe with my keyboard arrow. So let's have a look at the before and after here. I'm turning that layer off and back on again there, and Command 0 to just have a look at the whole image, turning it off and back on again here. What I'm going to do is also just hitch up the very lightest highlights in case there are some very bright highlights lurking in here. I might even lift this up a little bit more as well. I really want that to be quite convincing. So off and on again. And as you can see, that works pretty well. Now there's nothing to stop me from using a bit of this adjustment in the grass as well. It does lighten generally, and that's what we want to do with the grass. But I don't want to lighten the dress more, and certainly not down here. So what I'm going to do is select again the bride here in the channels. Of course then I've got to feather it again. So I select and modify feather and 1 pixel, and select modify, and also expand this selection just a touch. And then I'm going to Shift Command I to inverse the selection, and you now see that you've inversed it because you've got the marching ants around the frame as well. Taking the gradient and making sure that I've got white, linear, and there. That's set to 100% opacity. That's maybe a bit too strong, but we can see how this goes. I'm going to Command H to hide the marching ants before I pull that in. So I'm going to pull that upwards further perhaps than you would expect me to do, because I'm hoping that it will fall off. Well, that looks fine, but a bit too strong. So Command Z and just take the opacity down to 60% and perhaps go a little easier on dragging it, not dragging it too far. And that lightens the grass using just the same curve, and that's what I call economy. You don't really need masses of curves doing the same thing. If you've got a curve that's doing one thing, it can easily do another, unless of course it needs another kind of color correction. And on that note, I'm actually going to go back to the curves below, and I'm going to reveal a bit more of that adjustment, because that's a darkening adjustment, and I'm feeling it's a bit too bright here back in the forest areas here. So I'm going to just take a brush there. It may not have a massive effect. I'm going to just set the opacity and flow a bit higher and you can see here that that darkens down that overlit area in the background there. So now we have a better balance between that area and the one behind her. We may need to actually do another adjustment there, and I think that's going to be the next thing I do. First I have to remember to deselect, because I've actually got a selection here. You can see Command H that I do have a selection. So Command D to deselect, and I'm going to make a new selection with a marquee tool here and see if I can bring out just a little bit more of the highlights in the background. I'd like to put that layer on top so that I don't have any interference with the work that I've already done. So using again a curves layer and target tool, and find the lightest point I can see in there, just hitching that up a little bit, maybe getting a bit more contrast into it by lifting it up there as well. Actually, I'm going to now just edit, fill, and with black again, and just reveal that with a brush, perhaps using these settings that I've got here. That should work fine. I may not use that at 100%, we'll see. Here I have to take real care not to spill into the white clouds, but that looks fine. I'm going to actually add even a bit more contrast there, raising that curve a bit more because you have no highlights there, and then zoom in and make sure there's no white halo in the background there. Now let's look at what these three combined adjustments have done for the image. I'm going to turn off all the eyeballs in one go, and you see the image as it was before. And there is a great improvement, but I would like to change the colour of the greens ever so slightly, and I might like to get rid of a little bit of a red cast in the dress. So first of all, I'm going to use a hue saturation. We're going to target these greens here in the background and here in the foreground. So I'm going to greens as you would do. You're seeing grass and trees. And then I'm going to use this eyedropper here and click on a very typical green here. And you see here, and very typically it goes to yellows too. Photoshop tends to see what we often see as green as yellows, and this is quite normal, so don't dispute it, just let it go, and then move the hue slightly over to the right, plus 3 or 4 perhaps, and that brings the grass more into that sort of green greenness. 3 is probably enough actually. I'm going to just highlight that number there and just change that to 3. Because the redness here needs to be selectively used, I'm just going to target that on a different layer. So again, that's going to be a hue saturation. Now if I put the cursor in the image on the dress, I can read off in the info that it's about sort of 5 points higher in the red than it is in the other two channels, and I'm kind of assuming that the dress should be white and not cream. Cream anyway would be more yellow. So I'm using this hue saturation all over. I'm going to make sure I mask it off in the rest of the skin and the flowers. So I'm going to go in the reds and then just take the saturation of the reds down a bit. And as you can see there, the dress goes more neutral, but her skin also does. So I'm going to zoom in and make sure that we take a brush tool at 100% to bring back the warmness in her skin. I've got black as my foreground colour, and that's exactly what masks out the areas that we don't want to use from this adjustment. Now it's worth being quite accurate here against the edges of the dress, so if you need to zoom in more, that's fine. Against the sky you can be a bit sloppier because there is simply no red in that area. Okay, let's look at Command 0 again. And I think that has helped neutralize it just a little bit more. Let's have a look at those two layers, turn them off and back on again. Well, it's very subtle, but these subtle things kind of work psychologically as well. You may not see that there's something wrong with the color, but because these are memory colors, it will jar a little bit if they aren't right. So altogether, our color adjustments that were only selective, Command G there in the layers, and let's turn that off and back on again. So this was something we could do fairly quickly and with great ease. It doesn't have to be laboured over. And I do find that this is a major part of the work that goes into any image that I retouch on a day-to-day basis. So this is extremely important to know, and to have a good technique for it is essential.